Let's talk about another Azure PaaS service, this time Azure Key Vault, in respect to how we handle multi-region failover when using private link. Here I've got a VM in the primary region with a private endpoint that gives me access to my Key Vault. That's linked to a common Azure DNS private zone. The point of this video is to talk about whether or not we can utilize a single Azure DNS private zone or not, and expect if we can have seamless failover. Check out the articles linked below if you're diving into this topic for the first time. They lay out the overall big picture for Azure Private Link multi-region DNS integration. And there's also a second link which gives you a list of all the various Azure PaaS services and how they fall into two fundamental categories in terms of DNS behavior. You see here my Key Vault is deployed inside of West US. It's got public access turned off, so I'm using private endpoints only for access to this. And I've done my DNS integration, so if I resolve from this virtual machine here, I get back this A record 172.16.4.5. If we look at the moment how Key Vault is responding when you come from a non-linked VNet inside a public DNS, we can see that my Key Vault FQDN here, West US, gets immediately sucked into the world of private link. You see here there's a slight suffix change from Vault to Vault Core, which then goes to private link. And if you're not coming from that linked VNet, you get relayed here to a stamp inside of West US, which ultimately returns you a public IP, which gets you to the Key Vault service inside of Azure West US. The point of this video is to talk about if I do nothing with my Key Vault backup and failover strategy in terms of backing up those keys. We do have documentation on how to back up your Key Vaults, which you should be doing separately. There's a distinction here, right, between high availability and BCDR. So you very much should be doing backups of your secrets inside of your Key Vault, etc. And there is a process for moving keys between vaults if you were to manually restore from a backup in a DR scenario. What I want to talk about here is something slightly different, which is behind the scenes in Key Vault. If you look at the documentation, you will realize that the contents of your Key Vault are replicated within the region and to a secondary region, and that's the paired region. So even if I do nothing with my own backups from Key Vault, my Key Vault here is replicated from West US to East US. And what I want to talk about here is what happens if West US fails. How do I continue to make use of my Key Vault using private link, especially if I'm using a single private DNS zone? So the sort of short story here will be the TLDR version would be this behaves very similar to storage, which is you will have to do some manual efforts in terms of DNS if you are using a single Azure DNS private zone. So let's explain why that's the case. So one of the things is, unlike with storage and some other services, you can't manually test the failover of Key Vault. So I'll have to talk about this hypothetically. So let's imagine if Key Vault failed, this entire region fails, so West US goes down, what would happen? Well, if you dig through the documentation, if you're using private link, after 20 minutes or so, you will be able to access your Key Vault again using private link. Inside of public DNS, we will still have this initial CNAME happening here to the West US.Vault Core endpoint. And behind the scenes, the second line here will get remapped to an East US replica. Well, because that's happening after the initial private link insertion, we have to be careful with DNS integration. So let's imagine this entire region is down now. And I'm now using a virtual machine over here in East US, and it's still trying to access fundamentally my same FQDN for Key Vault, which is this keyvault-ws.vault.azure.net. That virtual machine will come back online, and because it's linked to the same private DNS zone, ultimately it's going to get back this stale A record here, which is in a region that doesn't exist anymore. So yes, we can create a new private endpoint, for example 172.16.2.11, which would exist over here, But for that virtual machine to make use of it, it needs to get back the right response from the Azure DNS private zone. So you'd have to have another A record in here pointing to the 2.11, but that would clash because you'd have two A records pointing to the same host name. You'd have to make a manual change here. But rather than belabor the point, go and check out the storage video for a more detailed review of your options there in terms of updating the common zone or using regional zones. But the point here is you have to be careful. If your plan is to rely on this single key vault here and the built-in replication, I say you have to be careful with DNS. Of course, you could address this at a higher level. You could use the backup and restore model. You could use separate key vaults in separate regions and maintain sync at a different level in the application stack. But the point here is that Key Vault is an example of a service like Azure Storage, like Azure Site Recovery, like Cosmos DB, where you have to be careful in terms of the DNS failover expectations in a complete regional outage. Okay, check out the other videos for the other services. This landing page here will give you links to the various service videos, and also they're listed in the YouTube channel. Thanks a lot.